All right. Hi there. I'm Kendall Qualls, and this is Fully Charged. On this podcast, we counter the progressive narrative and give you a perspective you never hear conveyed in the public arena. Thanks for joining us. By the way, you'll see Sheila coming in her podcast soon. She's developing that, again, targeted for women, by women. And in fact, today's her birthday. So if you can, if you connect it with her, make sure you give her a shout out on her birthday. Hey, today's subject is a controversial one, but it doesn't have to be. DEI, the big lie. We've had diversity initiatives in corporate America, government agencies, and public schools since the 1970s. And the basic premise has been this. Despite our many differences, we're all Americans. We have a common objective with our company, with our schools, with our sports teams. There's been no better institution that has displayed the effectiveness of bringing people together from different backgrounds and different ethnicities than the U.S. Armed Forces. Different social economic backgrounds, everything. And they've done it in style, they've done it with precision. And here's the problem. Today's diversity initiative, known as Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is not the same program. It's not the same program as the past. It's a political ideology that is undermining our armed forces, creating divisions in corporate America and our public schools. It is the main reason driving this is, like I said, a political agenda, and is really like the policing arm of critical race theory. And that's not just me saying this. If you speak to any proponent of this whole ideology of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, they'll quote Ibram X. Kendi. They'll recommend in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist. Well, let me give you an idea of what that book says. On page 19 of that book, he says, and this is a direct quote, "The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination." My friends, that statement and this whole ideology is an affinity loop of hatred. It's un-American, and we have to resist it at all measures. Now, Kendi's beliefs and this whole DEI agenda is rooted in an anti-American, anti-capitalist, socialist agenda. And if you read their backgrounds and you read what they're promoting, that's not an exaggeration. That's an accurate truth. So the questions many of you may be asking is, why is this guy speaking out against this stuff? What's his agenda? Do I have an agenda? And quite simply, my friends, their agenda, the whole DEI agenda itself, is rooted in hatred. And my motivation is quite simple. As a Christian, God expects his people to stand up against evil, and this agenda is evil. I also served in the Army. My father retired after 25 years in the Army. One of my sons is currently serving in the Army. And as a young lieutenant, I pledged an oath to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. And this agenda is a threat, and my oath has no expiration date. So some of my detractors may say that, hey, look, he really doesn't represent the Black community. He's a sellout. And to them, I have this to say. Every month we have volunteers from the Black community joining our movement every month. Unsolicited requests. We don't have an active recruitment program. They're joining on their own because they hear our message at Take Charge. It resonates with them, and they want to be a part of a movement that turns our culture back to its historical roots of faith, family, and education. We get emails from all over the country. Can you start a Take Charge chapter in our location in Los Angeles, Houston, Philadelphia, Chicago, many more every week? So before you dismiss me with some lame slur or some try to delegitimize who I am as inauthentic voice of the Black community, take a moment to learn my story. As a young boy, I lived in poverty in the gang-infested housing projects of Harlem, New York in the late 1960s. I was there with my four other siblings and my divorced mom. Later in fifth grade, my father came and got me and my younger brother to live with him in a trailer park in Oklahoma. I've witnessed the demise of my siblings, my mother, countless other relatives and friends in the Black community to the cruel world of government-sanctioned poverty in our inner cities. By the grace of God, I escaped that life. I obtained an education. I got married, raised 5 children who are now functioning adults serving in their communities. So to answer your unspoken question, how they try to delegitimize me, my background, yes, I'm married to a Black woman. We have 5 Black children. We have a Black Labrador Retriever. I pledged in the first Black fraternity in college, same fraternity as the first Black Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King. And that fraternity is Alpha Phi Alpha. My wife pledged in the first Black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha. And our children, we are children of parents that were raised in the Jim Crow South. I know what systemic racism is. We know it personally. We were both baptized in a Black church by a Black pastor, Tony Evans, in Dallas, Texas. And we're not confused about who we are and what we stand for. But here's what I can tell you. With all of that information I just shared, my identity is more than my skin color. I'm a child of God. I'm an American. I'm a husband, a father, and so much more. I'm not just one-dimensional. So don't waste time trying to marginalize me, or how about instead explain to your followers the real reason we're such significant disparities of the Black community to other ethnic groups. The Black community was stronger before we had help from the government back in the 60s, where 80% of families were 2-parent families. In fact, if you look at this chart, you'll see at the time of Martin Luther King's death, I was 5 years old, 80% of families were 2-parent families. In the introduction of these social welfare programs and the LBJ's Great Society Administration, marriage declined significantly over the years compared to any other ethnic group. Today, our kids on a national scale is roughly about 80% fatherless homes. And the tragedy of this is all of this has happened without one initiative, one national initiative, talking national scale, to reverse the trend. That's because they don't want to reverse the trend. If you can keep people dependent on government, undereducated, you can remain in permanent power. Well, that's what our organization is all about. We're actually looking to reverse that trend, restore the community, restore 2-parent families, and we're doing this on a national campaign. The DEI agents, they rave about the disparities, and those disparities are legitimate, but they misdiagnose, and in fact, they dishonestly misdiagnose the true cause of those disparities. And they're exactly what we talked about in just in the last few minutes. And they're really because of social welfare programs that have been existed now for the last 50 years. Today in our Twin Cities, almost 90% of Black children are born without a father in the home. I want to make sure we get this point across. No society in the world lives with 80 to 90% of fatherless homes as a culture. We act like this is normal. We don't address it. We didn't even used to live like this. This has been a manifestation over 50 years. In the worst of times in our country's history, we didn't live like this as a Black culture. Now, we know what happens with these kids. We have 50 years of evidence to prove it. Many of these children grown up in these fatherless homes, they're physically and sexually abused. And they have higher rates of crime because there's no father in the home to discipline, care, and look over them. Higher rates of prison. We know the statistics. Higher rates of dropout rates. This is the fatherless home issue, not a racism issue. And these DEI agents want to use the disparities to drive their agenda, but they never bring up returning families to the nuclear family situation to make them more stable. Well, with that said, take a look at this slide, and this is something you'll never see again. You won't see with the DEI agents. They'll talk about how Black Americans make the lowest amount of household income in the country, but you never see it split out this way. Married Black families are in the middle class, on average $76,000 per household. but fatherless homes, they were at 31,000. Now, you would think with this information, well, why don't we promote marriage and stability of a two-parent family? Because the traditional nuclear family is not on their agenda. As I mentioned, it's a political, social ideology, socialist ideology. In fact, one of their biggest proponents and allies is Black Lives Matter. One of the core tenets of Black Lives Matter was to disrupt the traditional nuclear family. Listen, my friends, just because these organizations and many of these people are black does not legitimize their position. They want to undermine our country and turn it into something it was never intended to be, and they're willing to do it at the expense of these kids suffering from lack of a good education and struggling in the streets. So this is what Take Charge is all about. We're fighting back against this woke narrative. This is just a subset of some of the volunteers that we've had working to help advance our cause. All of these guys, they're, I'm just God honored to be working with them. They want to restore the black community to what it originally was before we had help from the government, which was rooted in faith, family, and education. These people are, again, volunteers. None of these people are paid any compensation. They're wanting to do it because we're at its rock bottom. And our culture is being hijacked by these political organizations that are trying to represent something that does not represent who we are as black community. All right. With that said, I want to open it up for questions. You have the opportunity online to type in questions to us, and I'll happy to address those. And, we have one that has just come in. So why are they pushing this agenda now? You might have heard in the last few years this statement, and it has to do with politics. Never waste a catastrophe, never waste a tragedy. The tragedy that happened with George Floyd, that we all witnessed, all around the world, to be honest with you, the tragedy of that death and seeing it in real time, and the subsequent riots, they're using that issue, that moment of time, to advance a narrative that they couldn't have done any other time. Everyone was shocked to see how that happened. And how do we rectify it? What do we do? And a lot of organizations pledge money to Black Lives Matter. They pledge money to this and that. And when they found out later, Black Lives Matter took the money and they bought mansions and they bought personal items for themselves and did nothing for the people in their community where they got the money from. Not just here in Minneapolis, all across the country. They're users. And this DEI agenda used the tragedy of George Floyd's death to advance a political agenda. It is nothing more than a Trojan horse. All right, we have another question. Let's see. What's wrong with promoting diversity and inclusion? Well, there's nothing wrong with promoting diversity and inclusion. We've been doing that for the last 30, 40 years. In fact, early on in the 2000s, early 2000s, 2010 or so, before all this stuff came about, racial norms were fine. How Americans interacted with each other was probably at an all-time high from a racial standpoint. What changed, as I mentioned, was this narrative that's being pushed. My friends, we live in the least racist time of our country's history, and we're the least racist country in the world. Those are facts. Those are proven facts. And if you want, you can reach out. I'll give you the references. But here's what I can tell you. The vast majority of countries around the world have used our Constitution as a framework, an example for their Constitution. The only countries that have not is China, Russia, North Korea, and a couple of others. I think Syria. Everyone else has. Can't be that bad. All right, we had another question that's come in. You know what? I'm concerned about public schools and what's happening with my kids' education. Seems that they're lowering the standards at my kids' expense. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. It's they have an agenda to close the academic achievement gap, and if they can't raise it, they're going to lower the academic performance of others, and that's exactly what's happening in our schools. Some schools have actually taken the word academic excellence, the word excellence, out of their mission statement. That's documented fact in our state. We have um, we have some that have taken out advanced placement courses and made it available to to all children. Well, you can't have high achieving students if you take away high achieving classes. Those are the things that are happening in our state today in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, this is not the same programs that we've had in the past 50 years in this country. They're using this agenda as a political agenda to drive a social narrative. All right. Any other questions we have coming in? I think we have one coming. I guess it's a long question. So stay tuned. Listen, there's a good article in the Wall Street Journal today on this very issue on DEI and how at universities they're interviewing professors, and not only are they interviewing the professors on their credibility, their content, of what they can bring to the university. They're knocking them because they didn't start out with a statement, a DEI statement, like, I have to recognize that this land was taken, or although I'm not a BIPOC, I have. They basically this is like a pledge of allegiance that you have to do to the woke hiring agents, and if you don't do it, you're not going to get a job. It is indoctrination. It is socialism on steroids happening in our country right now under the name of this issue. It's wrong. In some cases it's illegal, and it's undermining the nature of who we are as a country. All right, next question here. How does the Black community itself feel about the decline of fatherlessness? Well, that's a great question. I'm going in my next podcast next week. We're going to have more explosive information on this issue, but also we're going to talk about surveys that we've actually published. I mean, these were very credible national agency level polls, and one of the questions was that we had in our poll was, are children better off with two-parent families, and should the government agencies financially incentivize two-parent families over fatherless homes? 61% of the people, Black community, agreed with that statement. They do agree, two-parent families. I'll tell you another one that's tragic. The next question that we had was, my children, it was a statement for them to agree or disagree with. My children are learning to read at grade level, mastering math, and are set to be successful as a result of their public school education. Only 27% of Black Americans agreed with that. This question, and the question behind the question of this two-parent family question and what's going on in our community, there's no platform for the large percentage of Americans, Black Americans, that agree with two-parent families, a better education. How do we get back to basics? There's no platform. The mainstream media, you never hear from these people. You hear from the loudmouths, the Al Sharptons and the local Al Sharptons. You don't hear from normal, everyday Black Americans that want a decent life for their kids. They want to get out of poverty, and they want to get out of crime-ridden communities. There's no platform. It's sad. We have become that platform for them, and we're promoting this agenda because it's the right thing to do. All right. We're winding down on questions, and I want to thank you for joining us. Before I end, I want to share this statement. If you love this flag and everything it represents, and all the things that it represents, the good, bad, and the ugly, knowing that where we've come from, the journey that we've gotten to this day, we've learned from, we've corrected past mistakes. If you love that flag and love everything it represents, you have no greater ally, no greater friend than me. But if you have concerns, you have issues with this country, you have issues with everything that stands, and maybe you're misinformed, I'm happy to sit down and talk with you and chat with you about the true Americans, not the propaganda that's getting from DEI, the DEI agents. If you're willing to learn, willing to listen, if you're open for debate and to have an open mind about it, I'll have a conversation with you and get you to this point. But if you have problems with this flag and everything it represents, you want to change it to something it's never intended to be, you have no greater foe, no greater adversary than me. And I'm not going away. And for all of you, thanks for joining us here and watching our Fully Charged podcast. We created this podcast to counter the progressive narrative, the narrative that you rarely ever hear, especially the big lie that's DEI. If you like this podcast and believe in what we're doing, consider subscribing to our podcast and to our website, and give us a 5-star rating. Importantly, share this podcast with family and friends. And to find out more about our work, go to our website at takechargemn.com, and please consider supporting us. Your support helps spread the message. And we'll be back soon with more of the perspective you never hear.